The discovery was almost accidental, the kind of moment that slips easily into obscurity, unless someone stops to look twice. Clara Hayes had been combing through the stacks of the San Francisco Historical Society on an ordinary Tuesday morning, searching for records of rail expansion in the late 19th century. Dust floated lazily through the shafts of sunlight that pierced the tall windows, and the air smelled of dry paper and the faint tang of metal shelving. Most of the folders she opened contained brittle contracts and faded newspaper clippings, hardly enough to stir the imagination. Then she slid open a drawer labeled Gold Rush Miscellaneous, and there it was, a sepia photograph mounted on stiff cardstock, the edges frayed, the image sharp in the middle but softening toward the corners. The picture showed a group of miners, no more than a dozen, standing in front of a crude wooden structure with the jagged outline of the Sierra Nevada mountains behind them. Their expressions were serious but not joyless, the look of men accustomed to labor and the weight of their own luck. Each held a tool, a pickaxe, a pan, a shovel, like a badge of survival. At first glance, it was no different from the hundreds of other images taken during the California gold rush, when photographers wandered mining camps offering portraits in exchange for a pinch of dust or a few coins. Yet Clara felt her gaze linger longer than usual. Something about the composition was off. She leaned closer, pressing the photograph gently against the table under the lamp. It wasn't the men's faces that drew her in, nor the rough backdrop of the mine shaft yawning behind them. It was lower, almost hidden in plain sight, their feet. The boots looked worn, yes, as expected after days of slogging through mud and gravel, but some of them weren't boots at all. One man stood barefoot, his toes caked in dirt, the nails oddly long as if shoes had been abandoned for weeks. Another's boots seemed mismatched, with one side noticeably larger. The leather cracked but strangely clean, as though it had belonged to someone else. Then there was the most unsettling detail, the blurred impression of what might have been another pair of feet behind the row, ghostly outlines cut off mid-frame, as if the camera had caught someone stepping away or someone half erased. Clara blinked, thinking at first that it was a trick of exposure, the kind of distortion common in early photography. But the longer she stared, the less it felt like an accident. The photo had the uneasy air of a puzzle, something captured unintentionally, but meant to be noticed by anyone willing to look close enough. She slipped the photo carefully into its protective sleeve and noted the handwritten caption on the back. June 1876, last day at Hollow Creek Mine. The words were written in slanted cursive, the ink faded but legible. Last day. That detail prickled at her curiosity. She had studied mining operations before. Usually photographs were taken at moments of celebration, a rich strike, a shipment of gold, a successful season. Rarely would someone bother documenting the end of a camp, especially if it had been abandoned. All afternoon, Clara tried to focus on her original research, but the photo drew her thoughts back like a magnet. She made a digital scan, zooming in until the grain of the paper itself seemed to blur into tiny mountains and valleys. The feet became clearer in some ways, more distorted in others. The barefoot miner's stance suggested pain, as though every pebble pressed into his skin. The mismatched boots were far too large for their wearer, and those faint, almost transparent shapes at the bottom edge, they did not look like miners at all. By the time the archive closed, she had jotted only a handful of notes about the railroad and pages of observations about Hollow Creek Mine. She left the building with the photograph still vivid in her mind, tucked securely in her folder. Outside, the San Francisco evening air smelled of sea salt and fog, a stark contrast to the dry, sunburnt landscape captured in the photo. As she walked, she wondered why no one had studied it before. Why had it been tossed into a miscellaneous drawer, as if it carried no weight? Clara had no way of knowing yet, but that photograph, with its harmless pose and haunting details, was the thread that would unravel a story long buried beneath earth. Silence and the relentless passage of time. Clara barely slept that night. The photograph lingered in her mind, as vivid as if she had carried it beneath her eyelids. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the miners' faces staring past her, unsmiling, heavy with something unspoken, their feet anchoring the image in unsettling ambiguity. By morning, she had already decided her next step. She needed a second opinion, someone who could examine the technical aspects of the photograph beyond her. Historian's eye, she arranged a meeting at the University of California's Department of Visual Studies, where an old colleague, Professor Harold Madsen, specialized in early photographic processes. He was known for his skepticism, a man whose life's work was debunking myths surrounding daguerreotypes, tintypes, and glass plate negatives. Clara trusted that if anyone could either soothe her unease or sharpen it into focus, it would be him. When she laid the photograph on his desk, Madsen leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. The office was cluttered with camera parts, old lenses, and stacks of photo albums piled high enough to resemble fragile towers. He took his time, running a gloved finger gently over the cardstock before lifting a magnifier. "Good quality for 1876, he murmured. "Albumen print, most likely. You don't often see this level of clarity survive in a piece this age." His voice carried the dry detachment of a man who had seen thousands of such artifacts. But after several minutes of silence, Clara noticed his brow crease. "You see it too," she said softly. Madsen didn't look up. "The feet." Clara leaned closer. "What do you make of them?" He set the magnifier down, tapping a finger against the photograph. "This one, barefoot, dirt under the nails, toes spread unnaturally wide. Not impossible for a miner, I suppose, but strange. And these boots, wrong size, clean compared to the rest of his clothing. And here." He paused, tracing the ghostly blur behind the line of men. "That's no exposure error I've seen. Almost looks as though someone else stood here and was brushed out, or not meant to be there at all." His voice carried a note of hesitation, unusual for a man known for precise answers. Clara felt a chill. "Could it be tampered with?" she asked. Tampering wasn't common in this era, not like today. But double exposures, light leaks, those happened. Yet this doesn't fit those patterns. If it's manipulation, it's deliberate. He leaned back, folding his arms. "I can't say more without seeing the negative, if it still exists. But I will say this. The photograph was composed to look ordinary, yet it isn't. Someone wanted this detail to be subtle. Something they didn't want obvious, but not entirely erased either." Clara carried those words with her as she left the university. Subtle. Not erased. Why would someone go to such trouble? She spent the next days buried in records, chasing Hollow Creek Mine through dusty archives, county registries, and faded newspapers. The trail was thin, almost as though the mine had been little more than a ghost itself, but then she found it. A small column in the Sacramento Daily Union, dated July 1876, barely a month after the photograph's captioned date. The article reported, "Hollow Creek Mining Camp, once a modest yet promising venture, has ceased operations. Reports indicate dwindling yields and worsening conditions. Several laborers are said to have left abruptly. Their whereabouts remain uncertain." That was all. No details, no names, no explanation beyond a vague reference to uncertain departures. Clara's instincts told her that newspapers of the time rarely spared ink on vanished miners. They were transient, many without families to claim them. But something about the phrasing gnawed at her. Uncertain whereabouts, not moved on, not dispersed, simply gone. Digging further, she located payroll records held by the county clerk's office. The camp employed at least 18 men in June 1876, yet in the photograph only 12 stood before the lens. 6 names had no visual representation. When she traced their entries in subsequent census documents, Clara found only blank spaces where their lines should have been. Their trails ended at Hollow Creek. The unease grew heavier with each discovery. She imagined the missing men, wondered why they weren't in the photograph and why the ones who were present looked so strange below the knees. Did the feet belong to them or to someone else entirely? One evening, after hours of cross-referencing census data, Clara laid the photograph flat on her dining table. She dimmed the lights and shone a bright desk lamp directly over it, shifting the angle until shadows revealed subtle indentations in the print. To her astonishment, she noticed faint, almost invisible scratches near the lower border, marks that looked like they had been made by a sharp nib or pen tip. She reached for her magnifier. The scratches weren't random. They formed a single shaky word, buried. The word was etched so faintly that it might have gone unnoticed for another century. Clara stared at it until the letters blurred in her vision. The room felt suddenly colder, as though the photograph carried its own climate. Its own gravity. She whispered the word aloud, testing it in the silence. Buried. The photograph was no longer just a window into the past. It was a message, and whoever had left it behind had done so with intention. Clara realized then that she was no longer examining history from a safe distance. She had stepped into its unfinished story, one that was waiting to be uncovered piece by piece, no matter how much it resisted. And in that moment, Clara understood that the photograph wasn't asking her to simply observe. It was asking her to dig. Clara's research took her far beyond the comfort of dimly lit archives and brittle papers. The photograph had become a compass, pointing her toward a destination that no modern map seemed willing to mark. Hollow Creek Mine, the caption read, yet no contemporary references or geolocated records carried that name. To most historians, that would have been the end of the trail. But Clara's instincts told her otherwise. Places do not simply vanish. They leave shadows, even if faint. She began with county registries from the 1870s, poring over land claims filed during the height of the gold rush. Many mines carried names that sounded temporary, as though christened in haste: Bitter Gulch, Devil's Fork, Prospector's Rest. Yet buried in a stack of handwritten documents from Nevada County, she found a mining claim dated April 1875. It referenced a shallow watercourse called Hollow Creek. The land was leased to a collective of miners, names familiar from the payroll records she had already examined. The claim appeared legal, the signatures genuine, but no renewal was ever filed. By June 1876, the camp existed only in that single record. Clara marked the location described, foothills near the confluence of two minor tributaries east of Grass Valley. It was specific enough to suggest a real place, yet vague enough to frustrate certainty. Topography changes, names vanish. Still, it gave her a direction. The Sacramento Daily Union article replayed in her mind. Several laborers are said to have left abruptly. Their whereabouts remain uncertain. She thought again of the 6 missing men who never appeared in census rolls after that date. The word etched faintly into the photo's border, buried, seemed to take on new weight. With the resolve of someone following threads in the dark, Clara reached out to the Grass Valley Historical Society. The woman who answered the phone, an archivist named Dolores Price, listened politely as Clara explained her interest. When Clara mentioned Hollow Creek Mine, there was a pause on the other end of the line. Hollow Creek, Dolores repeated, her tone cautious. That's not a name you hear often. Not anymore. You've heard of it? Clara pressed. My grandfather used to mention it when I was a girl. Said there was a camp out by the ridges that just disappeared. Nothing but timbers and empty pans left behind. Folks claimed the ground was salted or the vein played out, but others said... Dolores stopped herself. Well, people talk. You know how legends grow, Clara urged her gently. Others said what? A sigh traveled through the line. That men didn't leave the camp. That the ground swallowed them. I'm not saying I believe it, Miss Hayes, but the story has teeth in these parts. Clara's grip tightened around the phone. Legends were never whole cloth. They sprouted from a seed of truth. Within the week, she arranged to travel east, her suitcase heavy, not with clothes, but with notes, photocopies, and the single image that had brought her this far. The closer she drew to the Sierra Nevada foothills, the more she felt the weight of history pressing in. The land itself was scarred by old diggings, rusted machinery half buried in weeds, shallow pits now filled with stagnant water, the skeletal remains of cabins collapsed under the strain of a century. Gold had been both the region's blood and its poison. At Grass Valley, she met Dolores in person, a woman in her late 60s with sharp eyes that belied her gentle voice. She guided Clara through the local archives, shelves lined with family Bibles, miners' journals and ledgers that bore the handwriting of men long gone. There was no surviving map that marked Hollow Creek Mine directly, but Dolores pointed to a surveyor's sketch from 1877. In faint pencil, someone had written HC along a creek bed near an unmarked ridge. It's a possibility, Dolores said, tracing the line with her finger. But no one goes there now. The land's private, owned by a ranching family that doesn't take kindly to trespassers. That night, Clara sat in her rented room at a small inn, staring at the photograph again. She thought of those men, 12 visible, 6 absent. If the camp had collapsed, if the mine had closed, Why had only half of them been remembered? And why did the feet still seem to whisper something the faces refused to confess? The next morning, she drove as close as the road allowed, parking at the edge of a dirt track that wound into the foothills. The late summer air was dry, carrying the resinous scent of pine and dust. With her satchel slung across her shoulder, she hiked toward the ridge marked on the surveyor's sketch. Hours passed with little more than scrub oak and stone for company, until finally the landscape shifted. There, half hidden by undergrowth, lay the remnants of something human-made. A collapsed beam, the outline of a foundation, shards of rusted metal scattered in the soil. Clara crouched, brushing away dirt to reveal what looked like the frame of an old sluice box. She stood slowly, her chest tightening. She had found it, what remained of Hollow Creek Mine, but what struck her most was the silence. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through this place. No birds called, no insects hummed, just stillness, as though the earth itself held its breath. She pulled the photograph from her satchel, holding it up against the backdrop. The mountains aligned. The outline of the shaft matched the dark opening in the photo. Here was where the men had stood. Clara stepped into their shadows, the air cooler near the black mouth of the abandoned shaft. She could almost hear the shutter click from 1876, freezing them in place. Yet in reality no voices remained. No laughter, no shouts of labor, only dust. Her boot shifted against something hard. She looked down. There, half buried in the soil, was the rusted remnant of a boot toe, the leather long rotted away but the shape unmistakable. And in that instant, she understood. The camp had not merely been abandoned. It had been erased. Clara returned to Grass Valley with her satchel heavier than when she had left, though she carried nothing more than soil under her fingernails and a rusted scrap of leather that barely resembled a boot. The weight came from something less tangible. The silence of Hollow Creek Mine, the emptiness of its ruins, and the certainty that those men had not simply walked away. Back at the Historical Society, Dolores welcomed her with hot tea and raised eyebrows at the dirt on her clothes. "You went up there," she said, not quite scolding but not approving either. Clara nodded, too tired to defend herself. She laid the photograph between them on the wooden table, alongside her notebook full of scrawled impressions. "I found remnants," Clara said. "Timber, a sluice box, and this." She unwrapped the fragment of boot toe, setting it down like an artifact. Dolores leaned in but did not touch it. "I told you the ranchers don't want people there," she murmured, though her eyes remained fixed on the object. Then softer, "You found it." Clara tapped the photograph. "I need more than fragments. I need their names. What happened to them?" Dolores hesitated, then rose and shuffled to a tall cabinet of bound newspapers. "The local press didn't cover much," she warned. "Too many mines, too many tragedies. People went missing every week. But I'll show you what we have." They worked side by side through brittle pages of the Grass Valley Telegraph, the Sacramento Daily Union, the Nevada Democrat. Articles spoke of cave-ins, disputes, cholera outbreaks, men who struck rich only to be robbed or killed on their way to town. But when Clara narrowed the dates to the summer of 1876, patterns emerged. One clipping, August 2nd, 1876, caught her attention. "Mystery surrounds Hollow Creek Camp. Several miners have not been accounted for following the sudden closure of operations. Relatives inquired with authorities, but found little satisfaction. Some say the men departed eastward. Others whisper they never departed at all." It was little more than a paragraph, buried beneath advertisements for patent medicines. Still, the wording echoed what she already knew. 6 names on the payroll had vanished from the record entirely. She dug deeper. In the Nevada Democrat dated September 14, 1876, she found a letter to the editor. "Sir, I write with grave concern. My brother, James Ellison, took work at Hollow Creek Mine early this year. Since June, no word has come." His letters ceased abruptly. "The camp is said to be abandoned, yet no trace of him is returned. I implore the community for any knowledge of his fate." The editor's reply, curt and dismissive, followed immediately beneath. "Mining is a dangerous pursuit. Men come and go. We cannot be expected to account for every soul who strays into the mountains. Your brother likely sought fortune elsewhere." Clara copied the letter into her notebook, her heart tightening at the plea of a sister whose questions were met with indifference. There were more letters like it, scattered across papers, written by mothers, wives, and siblings. Each carried the same note of desperation, a cry into silence. None received satisfying answers, but what struck Clara most was the absence. After October 1876, Hollow Creek Mine vanished from print altogether. No reports of sale, no record of reclamation. The name simply dissolved from public mention, as if the community had agreed to collectively forget. She traced the payroll names again. Of the 18 men recorded, 12 had stood for the photograph. 6 were missing, James Ellison among them. Clara began cross-referencing census data, church records, cemetery logs. Nothing. No graves, no relocations. It was as if those 6 had been swallowed whole. Her mind returned again to the faintly scratched word she had found at the edge of the photograph. Buried. Late that night, alone in her in-room, Clara spread the clippings across the bedspread. The lamplight made the yellowed pages glow like fragile skin. She read the names aloud. Ellison, Carver, Diaz, McBride, Harker, and Cho, 6 men. 6 families who had searched and never found. She whispered them again, slower this time, as though reciting a litany. Something about the way the photograph was taken gnawed at her more than ever. Why had those 6 men not been present? Why had 12 posed solemn and stiff, while the others were absent? She turned the image over, staring again at the handwritten caption. Last day at Hollow Creek Mine, last day. Whose last day? The silence of the photograph, the stillness of the ruined camp, the erasures in the newspapers, they all converged toward a single truth. Hollow Creek was not forgotten by accident. It had been made to disappear. Clara closed her notebook and sat back against the creaking headboard, the weight of history pressing down. She was no longer dealing with mere curiosities in an archive. She was uncovering the edges of a disappearance that history had deliberately smoothed over. And with every page she turned, she was stepping closer to something or someone that wanted to remain hidden. The next logical step was to follow the money. Clara had learned long ago that institutions might forget names, but they rarely forgot numbers. Mining was as much about capital as it was about shovels and sweat. If men had disappeared, their wages, their supplies, and their debts might still be scribbled into a ledger. Dolores helped her gain access to the Nevada County Courthouse archives, a dim stone-walled basement where the smell of mildew hung heavy and filing cabinets rattled on uneven floors. A clerk escorted Clara past the general records and pointed to a locked cabinet against the far wall. "Old mining ledgers," he said. "They're rarely requested." He seemed amused that anyone would bother. Inside, Clara found what she was hoping for, the Hollow Creek account book, bound in cracked leather, its spine brittle with age. She placed it carefully on the reading desk, pulling on cotton gloves before easing it open. The first pages were tidy, columns of figures written in a confident hand. Costs of lumber, sacks of flour, lantern oil, and payments issued to miners. Each line carried dates, names, amounts. She read them aloud softly, as though conjuring the voices of men who had once stood at the counters to receive their pay. The entries continued steadily until late June 1876, then faltered. The final pages told a different story. Lines grew jagged, numbers incomplete as if written in haste or fear. One page ended mid-sentence, owed to Ellison 3 days' work at, and nothing more. The pen had lifted, never to return. Clara leaned back, her chest tight. She turned to the next page, but it was blank. So were the next 5 after that. The ledger ended not with closure, but with absence, as if the mine itself had been snuffed out. More disturbing still was a loose scrap tucked between the final pages. It was not an official entry, but a hurried note, written in the same slanted hand. "Keep quiet. The less said, the better." "Accounts closed." Clara stared at the words, her pulse quickening. Accounts closed, what did that mean? Wages left unpaid? Men buried instead of recorded? She copied the fragment into her notebook, tracing each letter as though contact might reveal intention. She felt again that echo of silence from Hollow Creek, the uncanny stillness that had blanketed the ruins. This ledger was no accident. It was testimony left in half-light. Later that evening, Clara sat across from Dolores at a small diner in Grass Valley, the ledger photocopies spread discreetly across the table between them. Dolores scanned the pages, her face drawn. "It ends too suddenly," she murmured. "If they'd gone broke, there would be notes on debts, auctions, transfers. Mines didn't just stop. They were sold, abandoned, something. But this... She tapped the page where Ellison's name trailed off. This looks interrupted, Clara nodded. Like someone closed the book mid-thought. The waitress refilled their coffees, and for a moment the normal world returned. The chatter of locals, the clink of silverware. But Clara couldn't shake the image of the hand that had written those final words. Keep quiet. Whoever had penned them hadn't been recording transactions. They had been leaving a warning. That night, back in her room, Clara placed the photograph beside the ledger copy. The miners stared out as always, their expressions grave, their feet odd and troubling. She studied their faces, searching for Ellison, McBride, Diaz, the others whose names ended abruptly in the ledger. But the more she looked, the more she realized that the 12 men in the photo carried no obvious mark of survivors. If anything, they looked like participants in a secret no one dared confess. A thought struck her, one that unsettled her more than anything yet. What if the photograph had been staged on purpose? What if the 12 men had stood there on the last day precisely because it marked a boundary, a closing of accounts? Not a celebration, not a memory, but a seal. As midnight crept toward morning, Clara felt herself caught in a widening net. The ledger whispered of debts unpaid, wages unfulfilled, lives cut short. The photograph bore silent witness, its scratched word buried aligning too neatly with the missing men. Planned behind it all was the eerie stillness of Hollow Creek, a place where silence felt chosen, not natural. Somewhere between the ink of the ledger and the shadows of the photograph, Clara sensed a story waiting to be unearthed. But unearthed stories had a way of resisting, of pressing back against those who tried to disturb them. Still, she could not stop now. The voices were too loud in their silence, and the next clue, she knew, would come not from numbers but from words, the testimony of someone who had been there, if any had survived at all. It was Dolores who placed the letter into Clara's hands. She had mentioned it almost casually the next morning, as though it were an afterthought, but her eyes betrayed the weight of what she was giving away. "We don't keep this with the archives," she said, opening a drawer in her office desk rather than leading Clara into the vaults. It was found among private papers, donated by the McAllister family. Never catalogued properly. Too fragmentary, too strange. The envelope was brittle, edges browned with time, the ink on the front nearly faded to nothing. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded into 4. Clara unfolded it with care, her fingers trembling slightly. The handwriting was uneven, as though the writer's hand shook or the conditions were poor. Across the top was scrawled, July 8th, 1876, "To my brother. Should this reach you?" Clara began to read aloud, her voice steady though her pulse quickened. "We worked Hollow Creek until it bled dry. The vein was thin and the dust came mean, no man getting what he was promised. We argued, fought even, but stayed on. For leaving with empty hands shames a man worse than death. The last days grew uneasy. Men vanished in the night, packed still at their bunks. Some said they left for richer ground, but I knew better. You do not walk off barefoot, leaving boots by your cot." Then came the quarrel over what we had found deeper in the shaft. I will not say it plain here, but it was not gold enough to save us, nor stone enough to call worthless. It was something else, strange, heavy, buried where no man should have dug. Some wanted it kept, others wanted it hidden again. We argued, voices rising. The next morning 6 were gone. We buried in haste what we could not carry. We marked nothing. We spoke nothing. And when the photograph was taken, I stood among the rest with mud on my boots and fear in my belly, knowing already I would leave before the sun set. I could not stay. Not with the ground so restless and the men so silent. I left with nothing, brother. Nothing but this letter, and the knowledge that Hollow Creek will never give up what it holds. If you seek me, do not come there. Forget my name and forget I ever worked that cursed ridge." The letter ended there abruptly with no signature. Clara sat in stunned silence, the words echoing in her mind. She could almost see the man hunched over, scribbling by lantern light, trying to capture the urgency before fear overcame him. A survivor, but not one who wanted the story told. He had written to warn his brother away, not to preserve memory. Dolores folded her hands, her expression grave. "We never identified who wrote it. The McAllister family kept it among papers from an estate sale. Could have been passed down, forgotten, misplaced. But it's the only first-hand account we have." Clara traced the phrases in her notebook, Men vanished in the night, not gold enough to save us. Buried in haste, I stood among the rest. The language was careful, almost evasive, as though the writer feared his own words. Yet the implication was unmistakable. The missing 6 had not simply walked away. Something had been found, something that divided them, and then they were gone. She returned to her room that night, unable to rest. She spread the photograph, the ledger copies, the clippings, and now the letter across her bed like pieces of a puzzle. For the first time she saw the 12 men in the photo, not as a group but as survivors of an internal fracture. The letter's author admitted he stood among them that day. Could he have been the barefoot figure, the one whose stance suggested unease, or one of the others, eyes hard and mouth thin? Her mind circled the phrase again and again. We buried in haste what we could not carry. What had they buried? The note hinted it wasn't gold, or at least not gold alone. Something heavier, stranger, and why would it demand secrecy? Why would it divide the camp to the point of disappearance? Clara stared at the ghostly feet at the bottom of the image, the faint outlines that seemed erased. She remembered the etched word, buried, scratched into the border of the print. The survivor's words and the photograph's hidden message were aligning, like threads twisting into a knot. By dawn, Clara had made her decision. She could not unravel this story from newspaper ink and courtroom ledgers alone. The truth lay in the ground, at the site itself, among whatever had been buried and abandoned. But if the survivor's warning was sincere, returning to Hollow Creek would not be a simple act of investigation. It would be a trespass against a silence that had been carefully maintained for nearly 150 years. And yet, Clara could not resist. The photograph was no longer just a historical curiosity. It was an invitation. The decision to return to Hollow Creek weighed on Clara like a secret she could not share. She told Dolores only half of her plan. I'll visit the ridge again, take photographs of the ruins for documentation, but left unspoken the real intent, to look deeper, to search for what the survivor's letter described as hastily buried, the thing that had split the camp apart. The late afternoon sun slanted over the Sierra Nevada foothills as she parked her rental near the end of a dirt track. She shouldered her satchel, packed heavier this time, a flashlight, gloves, a small trowel, and her recorder. She also carried the photograph, carefully sealed in a plastic sleeve. Somehow she couldn't bring herself to leave it behind. It felt less like evidence now and more like a compass. The ridge greeted her with the same uncanny silence as before. The air was dry, scented with pine sap and dust, but no bird calls filled the space, no insect hum. The ruins looked smaller than she remembered, as though the weight of history had pressed them further into the ground in her absence. She moved past the collapsed beams and scattered metal, stopping before the dark mouth of the old shaft. Here, the miners had posed in 1876. Here, the survivor had stood with mud on his boots and fear in his belly. Clara lifted the photograph against the landscape again, aligning the jagged line of mountains behind. The match was exact. She lowered it, heart racing. She approached the shaft cautiously. Time and erosion had collapsed part of the entrance, leaving a jagged opening half filled with stone and soil. She crouched, running her gloved hand over the packed earth. It smelled faintly metallic, the way damp stone sometimes does. Though the day was hot and dry, her flashlight beam cut into the darkness. The passage extended only a few feet before narrowing into rubble. But on the left side, half concealed by brush, Clara noticed something. A secondary hollow, smaller, as if a side tunnel had been started and abandoned. She pushed aside branches and crouched lower. The opening was little more than a crawl space now, but it bore the marks of human tools, chisel lines, pickaxe strikes, the geometry of deliberate work. Her pulse quickened. Could this be where they had buried in haste? She reached into her satchel, pulling out her recorder. Her voice sounded steady, though her hands trembled. Field notes, Hollow Creek mine. Side entrance discovered near main shaft, partially obscured. Signs of human excavation. Possible site of burial or storage. Laying the recorder down, she began to dig carefully with her trowel, pulling loose soil and rocks from the hollow. The work was slow, her breath harsh in the silence, each scrape of metal against stone loud in her ears. After 20 minutes, she struck something solid, not rock but wood. Clara froze. She brushed more soil aside, revealing the corner of a plank. Another few minutes of work uncovered a rough wooden box, no larger than a trunk. its surface blackened with age and damp. She sat back on her heels staring at it, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it. The survivor's words echoed in her mind. "We buried in haste what we could not carry." With trembling hands, Clara cleared more soil until the trunk was exposed. The wood was cracked but intact, the nails rusted. She ran her fingers over the surface, expecting to feel the give of old wood, but instead she found something carved into it. Letters, faint but deliberate. She shone her flashlight closer. It was a name. Or what was left of one. The rest had rotted away. But she knew. Ellison, the missing brother whose family had pleaded for answers in the Nevada Democrat. Clara's throat tightened. She pressed her ear close to the wood, as if she might hear something beneath. Only silence answered. She should have stopped there. She knew it. But curiosity was a stronger force than caution. She wedged the tip of her trowel beneath the lid and pushed. The wood creaked, splintering at the edges until finally the top shifted enough for a gap. The smell that rose was not decay but something older, stranger. The dry mineral scent of stone mixed with a faint metallic tang. Inside, wrapped in rotting canvas, lay bones. Not a full skeleton, but fragments, a femur, a scattering of ribs, what looked like a jaw. Beside them, incongruously, was a small leather pouch. Clara reached for it instinctively, pulling it free. The pouch was stiff, the drawstring brittle. She opened it carefully and tipped the contents into her palm. Gold dust. Not much, but enough to glitter in the fading light. She stared at it, torn between awe and dread. The survivor had written, "It was not gold enough to save us, nor stone enough to call worthless. It was something else." Yet here it was, gold and bones buried together. Why would they bury both in the same box? Why carve Ellison's name? Why erase the records, the ledgers, the very memory of this place? The silence deepened around her. Clara's flashlight flickered. A cool wind moved through the shaft mouth, raising goosebumps on her arms despite the heat. She shoved the pouch back into her satchel and carefully closed the box again, covering it with soil until it was hidden once more. Her recorder captured her voice, low and strained. Partial remains found. Box marked with Ellison's name. Gold dust present. Burial was deliberate, concealed. Strong indication miners covered this site intentionally. She turned off the flashlight, shouldered her satchel and backed out of the hollow, her movements jerky, hurried. When she reached the clearing outside, the weight of air felt lighter, though the silence remained. Clara stood where the photograph had been taken and looked down at her boots. She imagined the miners, their mismatched footwear, the barefoot figure, the blurred shapes behind. And for the first time she felt certain. The photograph had not captured them as workers or comrades. It had captured them as witnesses. Witnesses to something they had sworn never to speak aloud. And yet one of them had scratched a single word into the border of the photograph, knowing someone might see it someday, buried. Clara was now the one who had seen it, and she knew she would have to go deeper still. The storm came 2 nights later, sudden and fierce, as though the foothills themselves had decided to shift their weight. Clara watched it from the window of her small inn-room, the rain slashing against the glass in wild sheets, thunder rolling across the ridges like a drumbeat. Lightning split the sky in jagged cracks, illuminating the mountains in stark white flashes. She could not help but think of the miners, exposed to weather like this with little more than timber cabins for protection, their lives bound by earth, sky, and what the ground chose to yield. When dawn arrived, the storm had passed, leaving the world raw and washed clean. Clara returned to Hollow Creek that morning, her boots squelching in the mud as she climbed the ridge once more. The path she had taken days before was unrecognizable. Erosion had carved new rivulets into the soil, toppled brush, and revealed pale streaks of stone where earth had peeled away. It was near the collapsed shaft that she noticed it, a slumped patch of ground where water had rushed down the slope, carrying soil away in a jagged channel. At the edge of that scar, half submerged in muck, lay something that stopped her mid-step. A boot, not a fragment this time, but nearly whole, the leather swollen from moisture, yet unmistakable. The sole was cracked, the stitching frayed. Beside it, jutting from the loosened earth, another boot appeared, its top folded inward. Clara crouched, her breath quick and shallow, brushing away wet soil with trembling hands. The second boot was larger, heavy, and still carried the faint outline of a foot inside. She pulled back, heart pounding. These weren't relics discarded after years of use. They were still occupied. Summoning her courage, Clara cleared more earth from the slope. Within minutes, she uncovered the unmistakable shape of human remains. The boots still encased ankles, bones brittle and discolored by time. Above them, fragments of fabric clung stubbornly to the soil, a ghost of trousers that had long since rotted away. She swallowed hard. The storm had unearthed what the miners had tried to bury. Clara forced herself to steady her breathing. She took out her recorder, her voice breaking as she spoke. Discovery of partially exposed remains, located downslope from main shaft. Boots intact, skeletal fragments still present. Likely burial disturbed by storm erosion. As she spoke, her gaze fell on the boots again. They didn't match. One was scuffed and thin-soled, the sort of boot bought cheaply. The other was thick, well-made, its stitching finer. They belonged to different owners. Two men, buried hastily in one shallow grave. Her hands shook as she sifted through the mud, uncovering a rusted belt buckle, then the rounded handle of what might have been a pickaxe, broken clean in two. The shaft had splintered not by decay but by force. Clara sat back, mud caking her gloves, and stared at the remains. In the photograph, one man had stood with mismatched boots, one larger than the other. She remembered Professor Madsen's voice. Wrong size, strangely clean, as though they belonged to someone else. A chill moved down her spine. What if the man in the photograph had been wearing these very boots? Not his own, but taken from someone buried beneath his feet? The thought made her stomach knot. The photograph was no simple portrait. It was evidence, a silent confession hidden in plain sight. She documented the site carefully, taking photographs with her phone, marking the location on her map. But as she stood to leave, something caught her eye a few feet downslope, a small bundle of cloth protruding from the mud. She hesitated, then knelt again, pulling it free. It was a scrap of canvas, stiff with age, tied clumsily with cord. When she loosened it, gold dust spilled into her palm, just as it had from the pouch she found in the buried box. But this time, mingled with the dust, lay something else, a tooth. Human, yellowed with age. Clara froze, the rain-damp air heavy in her lungs. The survivor's words rang again in her memory. We buried in haste what we could not carry. She resealed the pouch and tucked it into her satchel, her mind racing. There was no longer any question that the miners had buried more than gold. They had buried men. They had mixed wealth and death, sealing them together in shallow graves that storms and time could not keep hidden. As Clara climbed back up the ridge, she looked once more at the ruins of Hollow Creek. The photograph, the ledger, the letter, all of it pointed to a moment of fracture. When survival and silence demanded choices no man should have had to make. The ground had begun to give its answers back, piece by piece. But Clara knew the story was still incomplete. One puzzle remained unsolved, the photographer himself. The man who had stood before the miners, captured their uneasy stances, and left behind an image that spoke louder in silence than in words. If anyone had known what truly happened at Hollow Creek, it was Elijah Boone, the man behind the lens, and Clara was determined to find his trail. Clara knew from her earliest days in archival research that photographs were never accidents. Someone always stood behind the camera. Someone made the choice to frame a scene, to press the shutter. At Hollow Creek, that person had been Elijah Boone, a name she found scribbled in the corner of the photograph's backing. Until now, Boone had been little more than a footnote in her notes. But the deeper she dug, the clearer it became. If the miners' silence had sealed their story, Boone's silence had preserved its image. Her first step was the San Francisco City Directory from the late 1800s, a massive volume that listed every business and tradesman in painstaking detail. Boone appeared in the 1875 edition as photographer itinerant, a common enough listing. But by 1877 his name was gone. No forwarding address, no new profession. It was as though he had vanished alongside the Hollow Creek miners. Clara pressed further, chasing his name through scattered records. A mention in the Sacramento Bee advertising, portraits and mining camp scenes, Elijah Boone, traveling photographer. A notice of a studio briefly opened in Nevada City. But then silence. No obituary, no record of sale, no trace in census rolls after 1880. It was Dolores who gave Clara the lead that broke the trail open. One afternoon, as they sifted through boxes of miscellaneous papers at the Grass Valley Historical Society, Dolores pulled out a slim booklet of essays written by local schoolchildren in the 1920s. She flipped through idly until she stopped on one page. "Listen to this," she said, adjusting her glasses. The essay, written by a 12-year-old boy, recounted stories told by his grandfather. In shaky pencil script, the boy had written, "Grandfather said a man with a camera once came through the camp. He was paid to take a picture of the miners. After that day, the camp ended. Grandfather said the photographer never took pictures again. He would sit in the saloon with his camera on the floor, not touching it, not looking at it, as if it had betrayed him. Folks said he left town when the rains came. No one saw him after." Clara copied the lines into her notebook, her pulse quickening. If Boone had abandoned photography after Hollow Creek, it was not out of whimsy. Something he had seen or captured had been enough to drive him away from his craft entirely. She dug deeper still, locating a single surviving print of Boone's work held in a private collection in Sacramento. She made an appointment with the collector, an eccentric man named Robert Adair, who greeted her in a cluttered Victorian house overflowing with antiques. He led her to a back room where, under glass, he displayed one of Boone's early portraits. The image was simple, a family posed stiffly in front of their home. But Clara's attention went immediately to the composition. Boone had a careful eye, balancing light and shadow, capturing expressions with unusual clarity for the time. She asked Adair if he knew what had become of Boone. Adair smiled thinly. "Ah, Boone, strange fellow. My grandfather claimed he met him once. Said Boone talked of Hollow Creek with a kind of dread, like it was a wound he couldn't close. After that, he never allowed himself near a camera again. Some say he destroyed his negatives. Others claim he buried them." The word struck Clara hard. Buried. Again, always that word. That night, Clara spread her notes across her in-room table. The miners, the ledger, the survivor's letter, the unearthed boots, all pointed toward secrecy enforced by burial. And Boone, the photographer, seemed to have carried that burden differently. Not by burying men, but by burying his craft. She returned to the photograph once more, zooming in on her scanned copy until the grain filled her laptop screen. This time she examined not the feet but the edges, the background, the shadows behind the men. Boone's lens had been precise, and yet faint distortions hovered in the darker spaces, outlines of shapes not fully captured. For the first time, Clara wondered, had Boone tried to signal something through the way he framed the shot? Had he left behind not just a record but a warning? Unable to sleep, she walked down to the inn's small library, where she found an old map of Grass Valley and the surrounding ridges. She traced Boone's known movements, noting where his advertisements had appeared. Hollow Creek was at the center of them. And then she saw it. A notation on the map where Boone's brief Nevada City studio had once stood. Next to the location was a single word, scribbled in pencil by some later archivist. Closed, contents removed. Clara's pulse quickened. If Boone had closed his studio abruptly, what had become of the contents? Cameras, lenses, and perhaps his negatives? Were they destroyed or had someone preserved them? The thought ignited something in her. If the Hollow Creek photograph was not Boone's only record, then somewhere, hidden away in a trunk or attic, there might still exist images he never dared show the world. She closed the map slowly, her heart thudding. The miners had left no survivors willing to speak. The ledgers had been silenced. The newspaper clippings had been erased by neglect. But Boone had left images, and images Clara knew always remembered more than they revealed. Clara began her next stage of research with hesitation. Records could be coaxed into telling truths, but families carried memories like fragile glass, often guarded, often distorted. Still, she knew the silence surrounding Hollow Creek was not only institutional. It had seeped into bloodlines, passed down in whispers and omissions, until descendants had inherited questions without answers. If Boone had left clues, perhaps the miners' families had left echoes. She started with James Ellison, the man whose sister's plea had been published in the Nevada Democrat. Ellison's name led her to a genealogical society in Sacramento, where a volunteer traced his family forward through census rolls and marriage records. The trail revealed that Ellison's younger sister, the one who had written to the newspaper, had remained in California, marrying a farmer and raising children in the Central Valley. Her line continued into the present day. Clara reached out to one of those descendants, a woman named Ruth Gallagher, who agreed, hesitantly, to meet at a cafe. Ruth was in her 70s, with silver hair tied neatly back, her posture erect, her eyes sharp. She listened patiently as Clara explained her research, her gaze narrowing when the Hollow Creek photograph appeared on the table between them. "My grandmother's mother used to mention James," Ruth said at last, her voice low. "But only in pieces. She said he went to the mines and never came back. When pressed, she'd only shake her head and say, 'We don't talk about Hollow Creek,' as if saying the name was enough." Clara leaned forward. "Did she ever say why?" Ruth hesitated, her fingers drumming against her teacup. "Once, when I was a girl, she told me James wasn't the only one. She said there were others, men whose families never got word, whose names were swallowed by the hills. She called it the Hollow Silence. I didn't understand then. I suppose I still don't." The phrase lodged in Clara's mind, the Hollow Silence. It sounded less like a description and more like an inherited mantra, a warning passed down without explanation. She sought out other families next. McBride's descendants lived in Oakland, though they proved less forthcoming. An elderly man named Thomas McBride opened the door to her knock, his weathered face wary. When Clara mentioned Hollow Creek, his expression hardened. "We don't keep those stories," he said flatly. "My father said they bring nothing but bad luck." Clara tried to explain her intentions, but Thomas cut her off with a sharp gesture. "You dig in old graves, you bring their silence onto yourself. Best to leave them where they are." He closed the door firmly, leaving Clara standing on the porch with the echo of his words. The Diaz family proved more complex. Records showed that Manuel Diaz, one of the 6 missing, had been unmarried, his nearest relatives cousins who later moved south. Clara tracked down a descendant in Los Angeles, a young woman named Elena who agreed to a phone call. "My father told me once that our family had a man who worked the mines and vanished," Elena said. "He said the story was that he found gold, but the others took it from him and left him in the ground." My father laughed when he said it, like it was a campfire tale. But the way his eyes shifted, I don't think he fully disbelieved it. Clara listened in silence, her pen poised over her notebook. "Taken from him, left in the ground." The words stitched themselves into the survivor's letter, the ledger's abrupt end. "The boots unearthed by the storm." When she contacted descendants of the Harker and Cho families, other responses followed a similar pattern. Either silence so firm it was hostile, or fragments of stories half-remembered, betrayal, disappearance, burial. The details shifted, but the tone was constant, uneasy, unwilling. By the end of the week, Clara felt as though she had pressed her ear against a wall of whispers. Each family carried a shard of memory, but none dared hold it up to the light. Together, the shards formed a shape she could almost glimpse, but not yet define. Back at her inn, Clara laid out her notes across the bed once more. Names, fragments, phrases, the Hollow Silence, left in the ground, buried in haste. They circled the same point again and again, a wound carefully protected through generations. She turned once more to the photograph. The miners' expressions seemed different now, harder, almost accusatory. They had not stood proudly for Boone's lens. They had stood as men bound by a pact, perhaps a pact sealed in violence. Their silence had stretched forward into the present, shaping families who spoke of them only in shadows, and yet Boone had preserved their image. Boone had left the photograph to survive. Why, out of guilt? Out of duty? Or had he known that silence, no matter how carefully guarded, eventually breaks? As Clara stared at the faded sepia image, she realized the story was no longer just about vanished men. It was about an erasure so deliberate, so carefully maintained, that even their bloodlines had inherited the order to remain quiet. But silence, Clara knew, could be broken, and she was beginning to suspect that someone, Boone, or one of the miners themselves, had wanted it to be. Clara's next step was to turn her attention from families and folklore back to institutions. She had seen how the Hollow Creek silence had seeped into households, passed down like a scar across generations. But such silence didn't only live in private memories. It was reflected in the way official records had been handled. Archives did not forget by accident. Forgetting required someone's hand. She began at the Nevada County Courthouse, where she had already studied the ledger. This time she requested mining claims and census records from 1876 through 1880. A clerk brought her heavy ledgers, their spines creaking with age. She flipped carefully through them, searching for Hollow Creek. But where the entries should have been, there were gaps, pages neatly excised, leaving behind smooth, thin scars of thread where the binding once held them. Clara frowned, running her gloved fingers along the absences. She turned to the clerk. These pages, were they ever recovered? The clerk gave a helpless shrug. We don't keep notes on why old pages are missing. Some are damaged, some removed long before they reached us. Removed. Not lost, removed. Her search widened. At the State Archive in Sacramento, she combed through census rolls. The miners she sought, Ellison, McBride, Diaz, Harker, Cho, appeared in 1875 registers, listed as residents of various counties. But by 1880, their names vanished. Not listed as deceased, not relocated, simply missing, as if someone had erased them between one decade and the next. She pressed deeper, requesting the Bureau of Mines records from Washington. The federal files came in reels of microfilm, whirring under the machine's light. Page after page listed active claims, production amounts, closures. When she reached the section for Nevada County, June 1876, she saw it. The microfilm jumped, skipping several frames. Whole pages were gone. She adjusted the reels, rechecked the index. The omission wasn't clerical, it was targeted. Hollow Creek had been carved out of the official record, erased not just from newspapers and ledgers, but from the government's memory. Clara leaned back in her chair, her reflection ghostly in the microfilm reader's glass. She felt the weight of what she had uncovered. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure Hollow Creek would not exist on paper. Someone with authority, reach, and reason to fear what the truth might expose. And yet the photograph remained. The ledger fragment remained. The survivor's letter remained. Erasure was never perfect. That night, Clara carried the weight of silence back to her in-room. She laid the photograph beside her notes, staring again at the miners' faces. They seemed less like men posing for posterity, and more like men standing trial, caught in a moment they hadn't chosen. Their boots, bare, mismatched, blurred, seemed to speak louder than their expressions. She thought again of the carved word she had found etched into the photograph's border. Buried. Her mind spun with questions. Who had orchestrated the erasures? A local official protecting the mining company? The company itself, unwilling to admit the truth of violence or betrayal? Or had the survivors themselves conspired, carrying silence not only into their families, but into the records meant to preserve them? As she pondered, she opened her laptop to review the high-resolution scan of the photograph. This time she ran it through modern imaging software, adjusting the contrast, the exposure, the depth. Slowly, details emerged in the shadows. Behind the miners, near the blurred outlines at their feet, faint impressions took shape. Clara leaned closer, her breath catching. They were not boots. They were bare feet, small, narrow, crouched at odd angles. Too many for the 12 men standing in the frame. She sat frozen, her pulse hammering. Boone had not captured 12 men alone. He had captured shadows of others, erased not by accident but by intention. The official records might have been cut apart, but the photograph had held its ground, and now Clara had proof that the erasure was incomplete. The camera had remembered what the ledgers and census rolls tried to destroy. She whispered the words aloud, her voice low and certain. They couldn't erase everything. Yet even as she said it, Clara felt a chill crawl through her. The camera had remembered more than anyone wanted, and she was the one who had chosen to see. Clara had spent weeks chasing fragments, ledger entries, letters, scraps of memory passed down through generations. But she knew, as she stared again at the photograph glowing on her laptop screen, that the heart of the story had been here all along. Every thread returned to it. Every silence circled its edges. Elijah Boone had pressed the shutter in June 1876, and whatever he caught in that frame had followed the miners into their graves, driven Boone himself into exile, and carved a hollow in the archives of history. This time, Clara was determined to see it in full. She arranged access to the imaging lab at the university in Sacramento, calling in favors from colleagues who knew her reputation for serious, methodical research. The photograph, carefully stored in its archival sleeve, was scanned under high-resolution equipment, each layer of its faded emulsion examined under light spectrums far beyond the human eye. Hours passed as the machines whirred, and Clara sat in silence, her notebook open but untouched. When the technician finally motioned her over, Clara leaned close to the monitor. The enhanced image appeared grain by grain, resolving details that had been invisible for over a century. The miners stood as they always had, serious, rigid, caught between pride and dread. Their tools gleamed faintly. Their hats shadowed their brows. But at their feet, where Clara had always seen blurs and distortions, the shapes now sharpened. She gasped softly. There were more figures. Not 12, but at least 15, crouched low behind the front row. Their forms faint but undeniable. Their feet were bare, the toes thin and splayed, the bones of their ankles stark against the dirt. They were smaller, slighter, not miners hardened by labor, but figures that seemed younger, weaker, almost spectral. One appeared to clutch the hem of a miner's trousers, its hand blurred as though Boone had tried to smudge it away. Another's face, half obscured by shadow, bore wide eyes staring directly at the lens. The technician frowned. Could be a double exposure, he suggested. Clara shook her head, her voice quiet but firm. No, Boone was too careful. He framed them deliberately. He left them in the photograph even as he tried to erase them. Her mind spun back through everything she had uncovered. The survivor's letter. We buried in haste what we could not carry. The unearthed boots mismatched, belonging to different men. The erasures in government records. The carved word, buried. What if the missing 6 had not been lost to an accident at all? What if they had been buried because of what or who they had found? Clara pressed her palm against the table, grounding herself. The faint outlines did not look like miners. They looked like captives hidden in plain sight. Were they other workers, unpaid and unrecorded? Were they men too sick or injured to flee? Or, her stomach twisted, were they children? She zoomed closer, heart pounding. The grain broke apart under magnification, yet the impression held. Thin wrists, small hands, faces turned toward the camera with expressions that did not match the miners' stoic resolve. They looked pleading, almost desperate. Clara sat back, her throat dry. Elijah Boone had not simply captured miners posing at the end of a failed claim. He had recorded a reckoning. The photograph was less a portrait and more a witness, an image meant to preserve what words and ledgers and newspapers had conspired to erase. She remembered what the collector, Adair, had told her. Boone abandoned his camera, sat in saloons with it at his feet, as though it had betrayed him. Perhaps it wasn't betrayal at all. Perhaps Boone had realized that the camera had captured too much. That night, Clara sat in her in-room with the enhanced image glowing on her laptop. She traced the faint figures with her finger, whispering their presence aloud as though calling them back from silence. Not 12, she murmured. 15. The realization struck her like a weight. The Hollow Creek photograph was not simply evidence of a disappearance. It was evidence of erasure by deliberate design. The miners had buried more than gold. They had buried lives sealed under soil and silence. And Boone, whether out of guilt or fear, had left just enough for history to recover. Clara leaned back, exhaustion pressing against her, but she could not close her laptop. She felt both exhilarated and unsettled, knowing she had touched the edge of the truth. Yet even as the outlines of the hidden figures sharpened in her mind, she understood one thing clearly. The photograph had given her answers, but not peace. The final chapter of Hollow Creek was still unwritten, and to write it, Clara would have to return, not to archives but to the ridge itself, where the soil still held what the rain had already begun to unearth. The road back to Hollow Creek was quiet that morning, lined with pines heavy from the recent storm. Clara drove slowly, the photograph in its archival sleeve resting on the passenger seat, as though it were her companion rather than an artifact. The air was cool, but her palms were damp against the steering wheel. She knew this visit would not be for fragments or notes. This time she was going to face the ground itself, to look fully at what the miners had hidden and what Boone had tried, in his own way, to reveal. The ridge looked different after the storm, as though its skin had been peeled back. Mud had collapsed in streaks down the slope, tree roots exposed like bones. She retraced her steps to the mine entrance, flashlight and recorder ready, though she suspected she wouldn't need them. The storm had done what time alone could not. It had loosened the earth's grip, and indeed, the soil downslope from the shaft had slumped further, exposing shapes Clara recognized instantly. Boots, bones, scraps of fabric tangled in the roots. What she had found days earlier now revealed more. the outline of at least 2 full skeletons cradled together in the earth. She crouched, her throat tight, whispering her field notes into the recorder. Additional remains exposed. At least 2 bodies buried shallow. Evidence of hasty interment confirmed. She stopped. The word interment felt too clinical. These weren't graves marked with dignity. They were hurried attempts to conceal. Her eyes fell on something metallic near one of the skeleton's ribs. She reached carefully into the muck and pulled it free, a tarnished locket, its hinge still intact. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, behind a fogged oval of glass, was a miniature daguerreotype of a woman and child. The face of the woman was stern, the child small and round. Clara closed the locket slowly, her breath unsteady. Whoever lay here had not meant to vanish. Someone had been waiting for him. Clara looked up toward the shaft. The photograph had been taken only steps from this burial ground. The men had stood over these graves, staring into Boone's lens, carrying the silence of what they had done, or what they had been forced to do. The blurred feet at the edge of the image, the mismatched boots, the barefoot figure, they were not quirks of exposure. They were tells, traces of men who could not wear their own boots anymore because those boots now belonged to the dead. And the faint hidden figures Boone had captured behind them? Clara shivered. Perhaps they had not been present in flesh when the shutter clicked, but Boone's camera had remembered them anyway, as though the ground itself imprinted its memory. She packed her recorder away and stood, staring at the ridge, at the ruins of cabins and sluices, heard the black mouth of the shaft. The survivor's words rang in her ears. We buried in haste what we could not carry. They had carried gold out of the earth, yes. But they had also carried silence, binding themselves to it so tightly that it stretched across families, across archives, across time. The 6 who vanished had not simply disappeared. They had been consumed by a pact that no record dared preserve. Clara knew she had gathered enough to write, enough to publish an account that would draw readers, historians, even families hungry for answers. She could tell them of Ellison, McBride, Diaz, Harker, Cho, and Carver. She could show them the photograph, the ledger, the unearthed boots, the locket in her pocket. But as she stood on that ridge, she also felt the weight of choice. Some silences, she realized, had been maintained not only to protect guilt but also to shield grief. Breaking them meant unearthing pain as much as truth. She sat on a fallen beam, pulling the photograph from her satchel one last time. She studied the men's faces, their rigid expressions, their uneasy postures, their feet that had betrayed more than their eyes ever could. And for the first time, she felt less like a detective solving a puzzle and more like a witness herself, entrusted with a burden Boone had left behind. The camera had remembered what the ledgers forgot. The earth had given back what storms revealed, and now Clara had to decide what to do with it. That evening, back in her inn-room, she began to write, not a sensational exposé, not a lurid tale of curses or hauntings, but a careful account of disappearance, silence, and memory. She wrote about the miners' feet, the blurred figures, the words scratched faintly into the photograph's border. She wrote about the voices of families who still spoke of Hollow Creek only in fragments, about the ledger that ended mid-sentence, about the gold mingled with bones. She wrote until midnight, her lamp casting a narrow circle of light. When she finally stopped, she looked at the photograph once more, propped against her notebook. The miners stared back as always, solemn and unmoving. For the first time, Clara didn't search for answers in their faces or their feet. She simply sat with them, understanding that some mysteries were not meant to be solved entirely, only remembered. And in that quiet, with the ridges still looming in her memory, she felt a strange peace. Not closure, never closure, but a sense that Hollow Creek's silence had been broken just enough to let the world know it was there. What remained buried would always stay buried. But it would not be forgotten again.